The smoke still hung over Pearl Harbor like a funeral shroud. Captain Thomas Mackenzie stood on the oil-slicked deck of what remained of the USS Oklahoma, watching rescue crews pull bodies from the water. The smell of burning fuel and death filled his lungs with every breath. Around him, the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Battleships capsized, destroyers torn apart, over 2,400 American sailors dead. In the distance, a Japanese reconnaissance plane made one final pass over the harbor, documenting their victory. Mackenzie could almost hear the laughter of the Imperial Japanese Navy commanders as they reviewed the footage. To them, America's Pacific presence was finished. The sleeping giant had been kicked, but surely it would never wake up. They were wrong. What the Japanese didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was what lay dormant in the industrial heartland of America. The foundries of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Newport News, the factories of Detroit, an industrial machine that, once awakened, would turn the Pacific Ocean into a graveyard for the Imperial Japanese Navy. But this isn't a story about all of American industry. This is the story of one particular class of warship, a vessel that Japanese commanders would mockingly call the Steel Turtle for its perceived slowness and ungainly design. A ship they dismissed as no threat at all, until it helped sink their entire fleet. April 1942, Newport News Shipbuilding, Virginia. The Essex-class aircraft carrier was never supposed to be beautiful. It was supposed to be fast, mass-produced, and deadly. As Chief Engineer Robert Patterson walked the skeletal frame of USS Essex, the first of her class, he didn't see the elegant lines of the pre-war carriers. He saw something else entirely, industrial warfare incarnate. "She's massive," said Lieutenant Commander James Riley, newly assigned as the future Air Operations Officer. "But she looks heavy, slow." Patterson smiled grimly. "She'll displace 27,000 tons, carry up to 100 aircraft, and we're going to build dozens of them." "Dozens?" Riley's eyes widened. "That's impossible. The Japanese have been building carriers for decades. We're barely—" "Kid, you don't understand what's happening here," Patterson interrupted, gesturing to the massive shipyard around them. "This isn't one shipyard. Look around America. We've got Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia, Norfolk. We're building carriers the way Ford builds cars. Assembly line warfare." Riley looked skeptical. "The Japanese already have the Kido Butai, the most experienced carrier fleet in the world. Their pilots have been fighting in China for years. What do we have?" "Rage," Patterson said simply. "And steel. Lots and lots of steel." The Essex was laid down on April 28, 1941, before Pearl Harbor. But after December 7th, the priority changed. This wasn't just another carrier. This was vengeance taking shape in steel and rivets. By December 1942, Essex was commissioned. She looked ungainly compared to the sleek Japanese carriers. She was wider, blockier, with a massive island superstructure that seemed to rise like a steel fortress from her flight deck. Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing reconnaissance photos, noted her design with dismissive commentary. One report, intercepted after the war, described the Essex class as Gang no Goi, Hagain no Kame, the Steel Turtle, slow, heavily armored, and they assumed no match for the swift, battle-tested carriers of the Kido Butai. They would learn the hard way that turtles can bite. June 1943, Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his office, looking at the map of the Pacific. Red pins marked Japanese-held territory. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, countless atolls across Micronesia. It was an empire built on conquest, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Blue pins marked American positions. They were pitifully few, but on his desk lay a report that made his eyes gleam with predatory satisfaction. Projected carrier availability, 1943 to 1945. Essex, operational. Yorktown 2, operational. Intrepid, sea trials. Hornet 2, fitting out. Lexington 2, under construction. And the list went on, and on, and on. "Admiral," said his chief of staff, "intelligence reports that the Japanese are calling our new carriers Steel Turtles. They think they're too slow to catch their fleet carriers. Nimitz smiled coldly. Let them think that. Speed isn't everything. The question is, can you sustain combat operations? Can you survive damage? Can you project power day after day, week after week? He tapped the Essex-class specification sheet on his desk. These ships have the range to cross the Pacific, the aircraft capacity to overwhelm any target, and the damage control systems to survive hits that would sink a Japanese carrier. And we're building them at a rate of 1 every 2 months, his chief of staff added. Exactly, Nimitz said. The Japanese think this is a war of warrior spirit and tactical brilliance. They're wrong. This is a war of industrial capacity. And they just challenged the nation that invented the assembly line. November 1943, Tarawa Atoll. The USS Essex steamed into combat for the first time as part of Task Force 50. Her flight deck was packed with aircraft, F-6F Hellcats, SBD Dauntless, and TBF Avengers. Her crew, many of them fresh from training, felt the nervous energy that comes before first combat. Captain Mackenzie, promoted and transferred from Pearl Harbor salvage operations, now commanded Essex. He stood on the bridge, watching the pre-dawn darkness. In a few hours, they would launch the first strike against Tarawa. Sir, reported the radar operator. Contacts bearing 270, range 100 miles. Looks like a Japanese air patrol. Sound general quarters, Mackenzie ordered calmly. Launch the combat air patrol. Let's see what our steel turtle can do. Within minutes, Essex transformed from a sleeping giant into a roaring war machine. Hellcats screamed off her deck, their engines shattering the morning quiet. Her defensive batteries, dozens of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon guns, tracked the sky, ready for whatever came. The Japanese patrol found them. 9 Kate torpedo bombers came in low over the water, their pilots veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. They expected to find slow, vulnerable American carriers, easy targets for their Type 91 torpedoes. What they found was a fortress. Essex's radar-directed combat air patrol shredded the formation before it got close. The few that made it through faced a curtain of anti-aircraft fire so dense it seemed impossible to penetrate. 1 Kate managed to release its torpedo before exploding in midair. The torpedo ran true, striking Essex's starboard side. On a Japanese carrier, this might have been catastrophic. Japanese carriers prioritized speed and aircraft capacity over armor. Their aviation fuel systems were notoriously vulnerable. A single torpedo could trigger cascading explosions that would destroy the ship. Essex shuddered. Damage control parties raced to the impact site. Water flooded into compartments, and the ship listed slightly. But her heavy compartmentalization, one of the features that made her slow and ungainly, contained the damage. Within 30 minutes, counterflooding had corrected the list. Pumps were controlling the flooding. The ship never stopped flight operations. 2 hours later, Essex launched her full strike package against Tarawa. 94 aircraft, more than most Japanese carriers could deploy in their entire air wing, turned the island into an inferno. That night, as repair crews worked to patch the torpedo damage, Lieutenant Riley found Captain Mackenzie on the bridge. Sir, we took a torpedo hit and barely slowed down. Meanwhile, intelligence reports that the Taiho, Japan's newest fleet carrier, has design flaws that make her vulnerable to cascading explosions from a single hit. Mackenzie nodded slowly. The Japanese built their carriers for elegance and speed. We built ours for war. There's a difference. Still, sir, they're calling us steel turtles. Mackenzie laughed. Riley, do you know what turtles have that rabbits don't? What's that, sir? Patience and thick shells. In a long fight, I'll take the turtle every time. June 19th, 1944, Philippine Sea. The greatest carrier battle in history was about to begin. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet, 5 fleet carriers, for light carriers, and hundreds of aircraft. His plan, Operation Ago, was elegant. Use land-based aircraft from Guam and the Marianas to supplement his carrier planes, creating an overwhelming force that would finally crush American naval power in the Pacific. Facing him was Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The core of his force? 15 aircraft carriers, including 7 Essex-class ships. Essex herself, along with her sisters Lexington, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp, and the newly arrived Ticonderoga. 7 steel turtles, carrying nearly 700 aircraft between them. The Japanese had numerical superiority in carriers. But they had made a fatal error. They thought quantity of ships mattered more than quality of aircraft, pilots, and doctrine. At 5:50 a.m., Ozawa launched his first strike, 69 aircraft. They flew toward Task Force 58, confident in their numbers and the element of surprise. They were detected on radar 150 miles out. Captain Mackenzie, now commanding the carrier task group from Essex, watched the radar plots with satisfaction. Launch all fighters. Combat air patrol intercept course. Show them what American industry can do. What happened next would be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. It was a slaughter. The Japanese aircraft, a mix of Zeros, Vals, and Jills, were flown mostly by inexperienced pilots. Japan's veteran carrier pilots, the men who had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific in 1942, were mostly dead. Their replacements had months of training compared to the years of experience the Americans had built up. Worse, they were flying obsolete aircraft against the latest American designs. The F-6F Hellcat was specifically built to counter the Zero. It was faster, more heavily armed, better armored. In the hands of well-trained American pilots, backed by radar direction and fighter control, it was devastating. The first Japanese strike was massacred. Of 69 aircraft, only 27 returned. They inflicted almost no damage. Ozawa, unaware of the disaster, launched a second strike. 109 aircraft. They met the same fate. American fighters, vectored by radar, tore into them before they could even sight the American fleet. Those that got through faced walls of anti-aircraft fire from the Essex-class carriers and their escorts. Essex herself was targeted by 3 dive bombers. Her defensive batteries destroyed 2. The third scored a near miss that caused minor damage. Within an hour, her damage control teams had her back to full operations. Meanwhile, American submarines had found the Japanese carrier force. USS Albacore put 3 torpedoes into Taiho, Japan's newest and largest carrier, their answer to the Essex class. Due to poor damage control and design flaws, she exploded and sank hours later. USS Kavala torpedoed Shokaku, another veteran carrier. She also exploded and sank. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 3 fleet carriers, over 600 aircraft, and most importantly, the remaining experienced pilots who could train the next generation. The mobile fleet limped away, broken. Task Force 58 hadn't lost a single ship. That evening, Mackenzie walked Essex's flight deck as maintenance crews worked on the aircraft. His air operations officer approached with a captured Japanese document. "Sir, you'll want to see this. It's a pre-battle intelligence assessment from the Japanese Fleet Command." Mackenzie read it, his face hardening. The document dismissed the Essex-class carriers as steel turtles, slow, ungainly, and inferior to the swift carriers of the Imperial Navy. He handed it back. "Make sure this gets to Admiral Nimitz. I think he'll find it amusing. Sir, we just destroyed the Japanese carrier force. What do we do now?" Mackenzie looked west, toward the Philippines, toward Japan. Now the turtle has caught up, and it's time to bite. October 23 to 26, 1944, Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would be the largest naval battle in history, and the death knell of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 3 other battleships, and numerous heavy cruisers. The plan was audacious: break through to Leyte Gulf and destroy the American invasion force. Standing in his way was the U.S. Third Fleet with Task Force 38, which included 11 Essex-class carriers. Essex herself was now a veteran ship. Her hull bore the scars of 2 years of continuous combat. Her crew were experienced warriors who had fought from the Gilberts to the Marianas to the Philippines. And her aircraft, now including the improved F-6F, 5 Hellcat, and the new SB-2C Helldiver, represented the cutting edge of naval aviation. On October 24th, American scout planes spotted Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. Mackenzie, still commanding from Essex, read the report with grim determination. "The Musashi is there," he said quietly. 72,000 tons. The largest battleship ever built. 18-inch guns that can strike from 25 miles away. The Japanese think she's unsinkable. "What are your orders, sir?" asked his operations officer. "Launch everything. If the Japanese want to see what a steel turtle can do, we'll show them." What followed was a masterclass in modern naval warfare. Wave after wave of American carrier aircraft struck Kurita's force. They focused on Musashi, the mightiest symbol of Japanese naval power. Essex launched 5 separate strike waves. Torpedo bombers came in low, dodging anti-aircraft fire to plant their weapons below Musashi's waterline. Dive bombers screamed down from altitude, their bombs piercing the super battleship's armored deck. Fighters strafed her superstructure, killing crew and destroying fire control systems. Musashi had been designed to withstand torpedo and bomb hits. Her armor was the thickest ever mounted on a warship. But she hadn't been designed to face hundreds of aircraft attacking in coordinated waves, hour after hour, without respite. By late afternoon, Musashi had taken 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits. No ship could survive that. She capsized and sank, taking 1,023 men with her. The unsinkable battleship had been sunk by carrier aircraft launched from the ungainly Essex-class carriers. But the battle wasn't over. Kurita, shaken but determined, continued toward Leyte Gulf. In one of the war's great dramas, he would be turned back by the desperate stand of a small force of escort carriers and destroyers, Taffy 3. But what finally broke Kurita's will was the knowledge that American fast carriers were hunting him. Meanwhile, in a desperate gambit, the Japanese launched a decoy force of carriers, nearly empty of aircraft, to draw away Admiral Halsey's main force. It worked. Halsey took the bait and raced north with the fast carriers, including Essex. On October 25th, Essex and her sisters found the Japanese carriers, Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, Zuho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The Japanese carriers had almost no aircraft for defense. American strikes overwhelmed them with ease. Zuikaku, which had survived every major carrier battle of the Pacific War, was hit by multiple bombs and torpedoes from Essex's air group. She rolled over and sank, her battle flags still flying. By the end of the battle, the Japanese had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. 1945, the road to Japan. After Leyte Gulf, the Essex-class carriers became the undisputed rulers of the Pacific. They supported the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They struck at the Japanese mainland itself, their aircraft bombing industrial targets and military bases. Essex herself participated in the first carrier strikes on Tokyo since the Doolittle raid. Mackenzie stood on his bridge as waves of Hellcats and Helldivers launched, heading for the Japanese capital. He thought back to Pearl Harbor, to the Oklahoma sinking beneath him, to the men who had died that day. "Sir," said Riley, now his executive officer, "intelligence reports that Japanese propaganda is no longer calling us steel turtles. They're calling us demons." Mackenzie allowed himself a small smile. "That's more accurate." The Essex-class carriers participated in Operation Downfall's preliminary bombardment, had the invasion of Japan been necessary. But on August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The Essex-class aircraft carriers became the longest-serving carrier class in naval history. 24 were built. They served through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and into the 1970s. Some were converted into anti-submarine carriers, helicopter assault ships, and training carriers. USS Lexington, CV-16, one of Essex's sisters, served for 49 years before being decommissioned in 1991. the longest-serving American aircraft carrier. She is now a museum ship in Corpus Christi, Texas. But beyond their individual service records, the Essex class represented something larger. The victory of industrial capacity over warrior spirit, of practical engineering over elegant design, of sustained effort over brilliant tactics. The Japanese had built beautiful carriers, flown by elite pilots trained in the way of Bushido. They had opened the war with stunning victories at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean at Darwin. They had expected that American morale would crack, that the soft democracy of the United States would sue for peace rather than endure years of brutal combat. They were wrong on every count. What they faced instead was a nation that turned its entire economy into a war machine. A nation that first carrier strikes on Tokyo since the Doolittle raid. Mackenzie stood on his bridge as waves of Hellcats and Helldivers launched, heading for the Japanese capital. He thought back to Pearl Harbor, to the Oklahoma sinking beneath him, to the men who had died that day. "Sir," said Riley, now his executive officer, "intelligence reports that Japanese propaganda is no longer calling us steel turtles. They're calling us demons." Mackenzie allowed himself a small smile. "That's more accurate." The Essex-class carriers participated in Operation Downfall's preliminary bombardment, had the invasion of Japan been necessary. But on August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The Essex-class aircraft carriers became the longest-serving carrier class in naval history. 24 were built. They served through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and into the 1970s. Some were converted into anti-submarine carriers, helicopter assault ships, and training carriers. USS Lexington, CV-16, one of Essex's sisters, served for 49 years before being decommissioned in 1991, the longest-serving American aircraft carrier. She is now a museum ship in Corpus Christi, Texas. But beyond their individual service records, the Essex class represented something larger. The victory of industrial capacity over warrior spirit, of practical engineering over elegant design, of sustained effort over brilliant tactics. The Japanese had built beautiful carriers, flown by elite pilots trained in the way of Bushido. They had opened the war with stunning victories at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean at Darwin. They had expected that American morale would crack, that the soft democracy of the United States would sue for peace rather than endure years of brutal combat. They were wrong on every count. What they faced instead was a nation that turned its entire economy into a war machine. A nation that built Essex-class carriers at a rate that seemed impossible, 24 fleet carriers in 4 years, along with hundreds of escort carriers, destroyers, submarines, and support ships. A nation whose inferior designs proved superior in the only test that mattered: sustained combat operations. The steel turtle mockery revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. The Japanese valued speed, elegance, and warrior spirit. The Americans valued survivability, sustainability, and overwhelming firepower. In the crucible of the Pacific War, one approach triumphed utterly. Captain Thomas Mackenzie retired in 1946 as Rear Admiral Mackenzie. He attended the commissioning of USS Forrestal in 1955, the first of the American supercarriers, ships that traced their lineage directly to the Essex-class design philosophy. At the ceremony, a reporter asked him about the Steel Turtle nickname. Mackenzie smiled, that same cold smile he'd worn in combat. "The Japanese were right to call us turtles. Turtles are patient. Turtles endure. Turtles outlast their predators. And when a turtle finally catches up to you, when those jaws close around you, you discover something important. Turtles might be slow, but their bite is fatal." He looked out at Forrestal, 60,000 tons of American naval power. "We were steel turtles. And we won." #, historical afterword. This story, while dramatized, is based on historical fact. The Essex-class carriers were indeed called variations of steel turtles, or similar dismissive terms, by Japanese intelligence early in their service. The Japanese naval strategy emphasized speed, offensive power, and elite training over the American focus on damage control, sustainability, and industrial production. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf occurred essentially as described, though the specific character of Captain Mackenzie is fictional. The numerical details, aircraft losses, ship sunk, torpedo hits on Musashi are accurate. The Essex-class carriers did indeed serve for decades after World War II, validating their robust design. They represented a revolution in naval warfare. The first truly mass-produced fleet carriers, built with the understanding that future wars would be won by industrial capacity as much as by tactical brilliance. The contrast between Japanese and American carrier design philosophy was real and significant. Japanese carriers prioritized offensive power and speed, with minimal armor and vulnerable fuel systems. American carriers, especially the Essex class, prioritized survivability, with extensive compartmentalization, redundant systems, and sophisticated damage control procedures. This design difference proved decisive. When Japanese carriers were hit, they often suffered catastrophic secondary explosions and sank quickly. When American carriers were hit, and many were hit hard, they usually survived. This meant that as the war progressed, American carrier strength grew while Japanese carrier strength dwindled. The steel turtle that the Japanese mocked didn't just win the Pacific War. It defined modern carrier warfare for decades to come, proving that in industrial warfare, the victory goes not to the swiftest or most elegant, but to the most sustainable and survivable. The turtle beat the hare, and it wasn't even close.